Hello, welcome everybody. We're just going to give it a minute to allow people to join. Please hang tight. Thanks everybody for joining. Just giving it one more minute to allow all of our attendees to join and we'll get started. Thank you. All right, it looks like we're starting to level off. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our fourth and final webinar as part of a partnered project with the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration and HIAS on a Pro Se Plus Asylum project. My name is Adonia Simpson. I direct policy and pro bono at the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration and will be your moderator today. Before I introduce our panelists and give you an overview of today's session, I did want to cover some housekeeping. So first of all, CLE is available for the following jurisdictions: New York, California, Texas, and Illinois for live attendees. We're going to be circulating the CLE form after with information on how to apply. We will be announcing the CLE code towards the end of the webinar, so please pay attention. And I do want to note that this CLE credit is being approved by a law firm partner and not being offered by either the ABA or HIAS. So if there are any follow-up questions, we direct you to the law firm partner for any additional CLE questions. So please stay tuned towards the end for the CLE code. Also, as by way of housekeeping, please use the Q&A for any questions that you may have. We have a fantastic group of attorneys who will be working behind the scenes to answer your questions. If there are some that are better addressed by our panelists, we will raise them, but please use the Q&A, not the chat, to ask any questions for the webinar today. Finally, as a matter of housekeeping, the slides, recording, and all materials will be shared after the webinar via email for those who attended and also those who registered. So don't worry, you will get these slides, you will get the recording, so if you want to tune in and watch it again later. So, since housekeeping is out of the way, again, welcome. And I want to introduce you all to our fantastic presenters today. First of all, we have Cynthia Katz. She is a supervising attorney at HIAS, but also a former asylum officer, so providing an incredible background and experience for you all today. Next, we have Lindsay Harris. She's a professor of law at the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clark School of Law. So, and also one of the first people to really widely share an experience about an Afghan asylum interview. So really fantastic speakers with a wealth of experience, and we hope that you enjoy their information. So before I pass it off to our speakers, I just want to give you all a presentation overview. So goals of today, we're going to give you an anatomy and an introduction to the asylum interview. We're going to be answering questions about what is it, who are the asylum officers that are conducting the interview, how to prepare, what happens during the interview, what's your role in the interview, and time permitting, we are going to walk through a brief mock that's going to give some practice tips and best practices and how to address some of the issues that may come up during your interview. And finally, we'll round it out about providing information about how to get involved, whether it's our Pro Se Plus Asylum project or also sharing your interview experiences with the greater body of attorneys so we can learn from each other. And then we'll be providing some other resources along the way. So exciting presentation. Let's get started. And so I want to pass it off to Cynthia to really let's talk about what is an affirmative asylum interview.
Okay, take off the mute. First step. Thank you. And we want to talk about what's the difference between an affirmative and a defensive asylum process. I think one of the key differences to distinguish the two is that the person in the affirmative context is not in removal proceedings. What that also means is that the person is not in immigration court. The person is filing that application with the USCIS's asylum office. What that also means is that that asylum office has jurisdiction over the asylum interview. You'll see on the form, it'll ask if the person's also seeking relief for CAT, the Convention Against Torture, as well as withholding of removal. Those are not within the jurisdiction of the asylum office. They are the immigration judge. So let's start with the next slide, please. I'm talking about that asylum interview in the asylum office. So it's Form I-589, again, to USCIS, not to the immigration court. Now, of course, there's some exceptions to this. For example, you all probably have heard about the juvenile asylum process, unaccompanied minors, and so forth. What we're concentrating on now are adults in the normal context of an affirmative asylum application. So though there is some overlap. What happens is after that form is submitted, the applicant is generally sent a receipt. The attorney of record is also copied on that receipt from the asylum office. The asylum applicant is then referred for biometrics appointment. So that's with the digital fingerprinting and digital photo taking. And then the person appears at the asylum office. And of course, there's a big distinction between what happened pre-COVID, what has happened now during COVID. But one thing to keep in mind is that this is supposed to be a non-adversarial interview. And we'll get into that. I know you all touched on it and those who attended the other webinars prior to this, but it's non-adversarial. And I'll go into more about what that, how that plays itself out. Next slide, please. And then, of course, here's a copy of the regulations under the Immigration and Nationality Act. And then we've got the cross citations in the US Code. Who are asylum officers? They are people who have been specially trained. They are part of the GS grading system in the federal government. An entry level, even though the person may be very experienced in other areas, the general entry level is GS9. I've heard more recently that there was a talk of even down to grade 7. So, but typically we're talking about in the context of that we have seen grades 9 to 12. So what does that mean? Some of those people are lawyers, some of them are not. Some of those people have PhDs. And a lot of them are interested in international affairs, public policy, and so forth. Some of them are retired US military personnel. They've come from other branches of the federal government. Sometimes they've been transferred over from other offices within what we'll talk about later on, the RAO component of USCIS. But generally speaking, they're grades 9 to 12 for asylum officers. The selection process, as I've written, is available at usajobs.gov. And there is a vetting that goes on. The initial application is done online. And there are a series of questions. There is a minimum degree requirement. And then the grading, where a person falls 9 to 12, happens to do with education and prior experience. So for example, I came in as an immigration attorney, lots of experience, and I was brought in as a 12. My colleagues were brought in as 9. Some of the people, for example, right out of law school would be a 9 as well. And then next slide, please. The onboarding process. So generally speaking, the end of the asylum interview process for asylum officers is an interview. Sometimes it's in person, sometimes it's telephonic. And then there's the long security check, if you will, background investigation of the asylum, potential asylum officers, and then there's the onboarding. Depending on where people are onboarding in that process of security checks also determines the scope of responsibilities or systems to which that asylum officer would have access. All asylum officers attend some form of FLETC training. And I think people who watch NCIS may hear FLETC mentioned all the time. That stands for the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And that is in Georgia. There was talk, I know, of including that asylum officer training in South Carolina, which is the location for the general USCIS training. So during FLETC training, asylum officers are exposed to general country conditions, conducting research, conducting legal research, determining how do I adjudicate a case? How do I do trauma-informed interviewing? What do I do when there is a child being interviewed? What do I do when there's a disabled person, an elderly person? How do I address LGBTQ plus claims in the asylum context? How do I adjudicate religious claims? All of that is included as a general overview, a very, very intense overview training at FLETC. Sometimes it, like I said, is not literally at FLETC. There is a virtual component as well as a live component in person. In my class, for example, I think there was a government shutdown, so we did not attend FLETC in Georgia. We were in DC at headquarters. During that time, there are training officers that come and visit from all over the country. We also had visits and training seminars conducted by people who, like ourselves, represent asylum seekers or provide expert opinions on asylum. So we did have some content provided by UNHCR, by the Bellevue in New York, the Bellevue Hospital's Survivor of Torture Program, social workers, MDs, all of that to give the onboarding asylum officer a view of what it would be like to be on the other side of that desk as an asylum seeker. So that's what goes on at headquarters. And then the asylum officers are sent out to their respective offices where they do participate in regular required ongoing training. Most asylum officers have have a minimum of one training officer on site. There is a weekly training component where people are introduced or reintroduced to country conditions as they are on the ground right now, as well as the headquarters, Washington, D.C.'s areas of emphasis. So I'm sure right now they are, as we know, the reason why we're here talking about Afghan cases, how to prepare to screen Afghan asylum applicants, what is coming down from Congress, and what is going to be the current shape of that program. So all of that is part of that ongoing initial training. Some more advanced training dovetails into what we're going to talk a little bit more and what we did specialize in the previous webinar, trig questions, for example. It also includes when does an asylum officer switch from the regular course of an interview to taking sworn testimony, when to contact your supervisor, what to do in all kinds of conditions. So it's the asylum training, initial training, as well as the ongoing training is meant to equip the asylum officer to deal with the unexpected. Next slide, please. So in the context of the asylum office, or RAO, which is the Refugee Asylum International Operations, or also called HQ, what the structure of that office is, first of all, the individual offices receive their national training from this unit, Massachusetts Avenue in DC. There are at each office, there are supervisory asylum officers. Those are usually what I was talking about, the grade levels. They are generally grade 13. And then there are section chiefs. So asylum officers report to supervisory asylum officers. So there's AOs, SAOs, section chiefs, and then there's a director of each office. A lot of times the asylum officer may pull in a supervisory asylum officer during an interview if there is something that's particularly needed for guidance from the supervisor. Sometimes someone representing an asylum applicant, and certainly you're right, may ask to speak to a supervising asylum officer. It's pretty much, I think, we've seen as immigration practitioners that high profile clients are often referred to HQ for review. And the definition of high profile may not necessarily mean someone that you see on the news. It could be based on a person's work. So there is an attempt, the purpose of that is an attempt through that referral system to sort of have a consistency among the offices. How are interviews being conducted and how are the applications being adjudicated? So I would suspect that or expect that we will see several of these cases that we are talking about, asylum applicants from Afghanistan getting referred to HQ. And that's an internal referral from the individual asylum office for guidance in how to adjudicate the application, whether it's background check, whether it's you need to know in Washington, this is who walked into our office or who's being represented. Next slide, please. So I had mentioned briefly non-adversarial. So I think it's easiest for attorneys to think about this in the sense that in court, there's, especially in immigration court, we've got the government, Department of Homeland Security, represented by members of OPLA, often called, used to be called trial attorneys representing DHS, and attorneys in the private bar, whether at nonprofits or large law firms and everything in between, representing applicants or the respondent when they're in court. So in the context of the asylum interview, the asylum officer's role is to elicit testimony, get that person's story. So that's the non-adversarial component. I think that's probably the easiest way to think about that. So during that interview, the asylum officer will review in particular pages 1 to 4 of the I-589 form, and that varies from office to office. And then officers have discretion. Where do they start on the form? How do they start? Do they ask open-ended questions? Please tell me where you live now. Or do they ask more pointed questions? Are you still living at the same address? And then also it depends on the volume of cases in that particular office and what's on tap for that day, how much time it may take to get through pages 1 to 4. And then of course, there's the statement in support of an application. And that statement is often compared to the oral testimony for credibility and consistency. So we'll get into that as we go through our interview, and particularly if we have time for the mock interview. I'm gonna hand it over to you, Lindsay.
Cynthia. That was, I know I learned a lot there, and thank you so much for sharing that insider information. Now let's turn it over to Lindsay and talk about some of the logistics.
Sure, thank you so much, Adonia. It's an honor to be here with speaking alongside Cynthia and also with the ABA and HIAS team. So thank you to all of them who are doing amazing work answering the Q&A and for all of the support. I also just wanted to thank everybody else for being here. There's more than 400 people in this webinar, so it's a little intimidating to be speaking to you from my basement. I think that it really speaks to you being part of a movement of people to welcome our Afghan allies. And so that's just tremendously important. Thank you to so many of you who are taking on pro bono representation of Afghan or other asylum seekers. all the studies show that legal representation makes a tremendous difference. And I'm of the opinion that no one should have to go through this process alone, given how complex and convoluted it is and just what can come up in the interview. So thank you for spending your time engaging in this topic. I'm going to share with you just a few kind of tips in terms of really basic logistics if you haven't been to an asylum office before. Now, I would really recommend checking in with folks who have been to and practiced before the office that you're actually going to be attending, because it's going to be a little bit different from office to office, but there are some things to keep in mind across the board. So first of all, what do you need to take with you to the asylum office? You're going to want to bring everything in your client file. This is a common issue, right? Like always they ask about the one thing that you don't have on hand and you need. So everything your client has ever shared with you, you want to have that on your person physically in the interview, including, of course, your own copy of the I-589 asylum application, because as the asylum officer goes through the form, you want to be doing the same thing and checking on your end, if there are any discrepancies. Same thing with the written sworn declaration that Cynthia just told you about. You're going to want your client's statement right there. You'll see in the interview many times the officer is combing through that and going through that and comparing your client's oral answers to the written statement that she, he, they have in front of them. To get into the asylum office, you need the appointment notice, right? Somebody has to have that with you. You also need IDs for everybody, assuming they have them, and any original documents, because the asylum officer may ask to see birth certificates or marriage certificates or other original documents. Now, these days, you can bring electronic devices like a laptop. They don't always do this consistently, but you'll often have to sign a form saying that you're using, the electronic device in an appropriate way, that you're not recording anything, but it can be tremendously helpful to help you take notes during the interview. And then you also need to make sure, especially if there's more than one legal representative, which I know there sometimes are when firms are staffing up pro bono cases, or personally myself, I'm often going with a student or two to an asylum office interview. You'll need to have that G28 form, the notice of appearances of attorney, as attorney or representative for everybody. You won't need to bring your interpreter. There was a question in the chat on this, and just today, USCIS extended their pandemic policy of basically providing interpretation for the 47 most commonly spoken languages before the asylum office. If you're outside of those 47 languages, you may need to get in touch with the office and bring your own interpreter in person. But right now, if you are on that list of 47 spoken languages, then you would not be allowed to bring your own interpreter. Previously, you had to, and it was kind of on your own dime, and you had to find somebody yourself. Now, telephonic interpretation will be provided, and I think people vary as to whether they think that's good or not. Sometimes, I was at an interview last year where it was an Urdu speaker, and we had to go through 6 different interpreters in the course of the interview because there was an issue. There are various issues with them not understanding one another. So you need to make sure your client is understanding, and if you are, if you speak the same language as your client, I always say you want to do your mock interview with somebody who with an interpreter, right? You want to practice that interpretation, because interpretation itself is a skill, but so is working with an interpreter, right? As from the asylum seeker's point of view, they need to learn to speak in those kind of one sentence or two at a time, short phrases, and pause, allow for interpretation. So you want to have done that. I also say if you've been working with the same interpreter throughout the process of drafting the client's declaration and preparing their asylum application, you should probably switch it up for your mock interview. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Back to really practical things to bring. So you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this may sound silly, but you're going to need to bring some water, or as many of you would probably say, water. But I say water. So you need to bring some water, right? You need to hydrate. Sometimes some of the offices don't have water fountains. So bring a bottle, bring 2 bottles for yourself. Sometimes they hassle you less if you're bringing it in a clear bottle and they can see what's inside. You kind of aren't supposed to eat snacks in the waiting room, but it's usually possible to hide a couple in your bag. And you may really need to. The asylum office interview that I had in December, my first for an Afghan client, we were there from 9:30 in the morning to 5:45 at night. Now that is not the norm, but it does happen, and you never really know how long you will be there. Also during the pandemic, for me, most of my interviews have been 5 to 7 hours long, whereas historically there would be more like 2 to 3 hours. And I know we have seen some of those recently too. So not to terrify you, you're not necessarily going to be sitting there with your client or being interviewed for 7 or 8 hours, but it could happen. So prepare accordingly. You want to be comfortable. I always say to clients too, the last thing the asylum officer wants to hear is your stomach rumbling, right? You need to eat something before you go to this asylum interview. They don't want to be listening to your stomach making all kinds of weird noises. You're going to, for asylum officers, usually go through security. So just like you're going in an airport, you might have to take off your shoes. So think about your footwear, if you want to wear socks. Think about what you and your client might wear to be comfortable. And, you know, often this depends on the theme that you're trying to communicate in your case and what your case theory is, right? You might want your client to show up dressed very formally in a suit or in traditional clothing from their country of origin, or you might want them to be more casual. It really depends kind of what you're going for in terms of your case theory. You're also going to have to follow whatever COVID protocol there is in place at the time of the interview. I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they just said masks are no longer mandatory at USCIS offices. They are using plexiglass screens, I think, and some of the offices, I know San Francisco just this week has said that they're going back to everybody being in the same room for interviews. Some of the offices have been doing, or most of the offices have been doing iPad interviews where you've not necessarily been in the same room as your client, or multiple people have been in different rooms on iPads, but we're going back into the same room for the most part. That could certainly change as things evolve. So we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the interview itself, and some of this Cynthia's really covered. So I'm just going to echo a little bit of what she said and share a few other nuggets of information. So we can go to the next one. You absolutely need to conduct a mock interview. In terms of timing on this, my personal practice is always to do it about a week in advance. That way, if I need to do another one, if it goes horribly, if it's a disaster, then you have time to do another one within a week. But you don't want to be doing it the day before the interview, because you don't want your client to come across as rehearsed or kind of over it, or, you know, having just been traumatized from sharing it with you the day before and then having to go through it again the very next day. So if I have an interview on a Friday, I'll usually do my mock interview the Friday before. If it's gone well, fine, I'll let the client rest and not have to do anything until the day of their interview 1 week later. If it hasn't gone well, I would probably follow up with a second interview on that Monday or Tuesday of the week of their interview. So you're going to start by, we'll do a mock interview today, and I think you have some materials that I use to prepare clients with kind of a script for a mock interview, but you're going to review the whole I-589 form with your client. You can think about whether it makes sense for you to play the asylum officer or whether it makes sense for someone else to do that and you to play the role as the attorney, someone who has been to these interviews and knows what they're doing. That might make sense. In general, I tell clients, I'm not going to be a nice officer, right? I'm not going to be super mean, but I'm not going to be friendly. I'm not going to be warm. So I'm kind of putting on a completely different persona when I'm an asylum officer. And I think that's the best thing to do to kind of prep them for the maybe worst case scenario. You don't want to terrify them, but give them a sense of what might happen. So you're going to go over those logistics with your client, right? Make sure they have a plan. How are they going to get there? What time are they going to arrive? Where do they need to park? Where do they need to take public transportation to? Who else needs to be there, right? All of the derivatives on an asylum application. So the kids under the age of 21 at the time of filing and any spouse at the time of filing needs to be there. And so you've got to think about too, how do you occupy the kids in the waiting room? Depending on their ages. Does somebody else need to come to care for the kids if there is no partner or spouse, second parent? And I usually try and really manage the client's expectations around the decision, right? So explain to them that they won't get a decision on that day. They will get a decision. It used to be you went back and picked up your decision within 2 weeks of the interview, and that was a very common outcome. But as Cynthia said, a lot of cases too, and I think quite a few Afghan cases are going to be referred to headquarters, and they're going to go through a more extensive process before they're being granted. So now these days, given the pandemic, the decisions are mail out decisions. So you're going to just receive your decision in the mail. It's very important that your client keep their mailing address up to date and change that with both USCIS through the online system. And maybe we can include a link in the chat to the AR11 form to change your address online. And then also actually reach out directly to the asylum office that has jurisdiction over your client's case and let them know that they've moved. In terms of prepping, you are also going to want to try to prep the derivatives too. So any children even young children and any spouse, you want to make sure you're going over the mandatory bar questions with them, and the resource that we're handing out to you has the questions that the asylum officers usually ask about crimes, travel to other countries, other potential bars to asylum. You're going to want to have asked those very strange and weirdly worded questions with quite technical language to your clients and to the derivatives, and to explain to them what they mean before you actually go to the interview. Okay, so next slide. What happens at the interview? So your biometrics will be taken. Now, I think Cynthia mentions once you've filed your I-589 application for asylum, you'll get a receipt, a copy for the attorney and a copy for the client. Then you'll also get an appointment usually to go to an application support center, an ASC, for your biometrics. The client will have to go and have their fingerprints taken and their picture taken. And so they'll do that same thing when they go to the office on the day of their interview. You kind of usually line up at the window, have that done, and then you'll sit down and wait. When the asylum officer actually comes out to call the asylum applicant for their interview, they are called by the last 3 digits of their alien number. So this will be on the asylum receipt, or maybe if they've had other previous interactions with the US CIS system, they'll have an A number. And you want to know what those 3 numbers are, because that's how the officer is going to call your client. So it'll be 393 rather than, Mr. Shah. That's dehumanizing in many ways, I know, but it also does protect your client's confidentiality. Interestingly, when I went to my asylum interview in December, my client actually bumped into someone she knew from Afghanistan in the asylum office, who happened to be a piece of the persecution in her case. So it was wild. You never know who's going to be there. So you want to be mindful also in terms of when you are interacting with your client and the kind of conversations that you're having in the waiting room, and make sure you're protecting confidentiality. Then you will go into the asylum office, and they tend to be pretty typical offices, right? This is someone's working space. It's not a courtroom. It's like a regular office, a little bit bigger than a cubicle maybe. And they'll have pictures of their family, or maybe their diplomas, that kind of thing. It's somebody's workspace. And they'll sit across from you. So there's a desk between you. And they will first dial in or swear in the interpreter and ask your applicant to take an oath too. The asylum officer will kind of give some information up front about how the interview will go. And then they will start in on biographical information, usually asking the questions straight from the form. So we'll do that with our mock interview for you today. And then most of the time during the interview, the asylum officer is typing the whole time on their computer and kind of creating a transcript of sorts, not precisely, but they're taking responses, because they do have to generate and justify their decision for their supervising asylum officer. As Cynthia said, like each asylum officer usually, unless they are supervisor themselves, even then there's somebody above them. So they're going to be typing away. A good asylum officer will explain that to the applicant ahead of time, like, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it. So the attorney role is on our next slide. I've got a couple of slides on this just to give you a sense, attorneys, of what to expect and what you should be doing. Number one, you want to take careful and comprehensive notes, right? I used to go and fill up an entire legal pad and my hand would be dying at the end of the day, right? You're cramped up, really working those muscles, getting everything down. Now we can do it on our laptop, but I will have pages and pages of notes, right? Really a kind of Q&A of what's going on. That ends up being really helpful if the decision is not the outcome that you wanted, right? If the case is referred to court, and we'll talk about that at the end of this session, or if there's a notice of intent to deny because your applicant is still in legal status, those notes are going to come in handy when you're thinking about whether you want to try and ask the asylum office to reconsider their decision. So as you're taking those notes though, you're very carefully listening, and there might be instances where you would interject. Now, this is rare. And as I said when we were preparing for this session to Adonia and Cynthia, I tell my clients, whatever comes out of your mouth is gold, right? That's what's really valuable. That's what the asylum office wants to hear and needs to hear. It is worth so much more for you to say it than it is for me to say it. That said, sometimes in certain circumstances, there are situations where you may want to interject. That might be where the asylum officer is clearly not understanding the response to a question, or where your client is not. And sometimes you just go down this rabbit hole and you can see this is going to waste a lot of time. It's going to be very frustrating for the asylum officer. You might want to just say, you know, officer, I'm not sure that she understood the question. Would you mind rephrasing that? Or, you know, we actually did include a piece of evidence at tab F on this, if you wanted to take a look at that. You can also point out if there are interpretation issues. If you happen to speak the language that your client speaks and you're listening to the interpretation and something is off, that is possible. If you've prepped the client, you know, 10 times on this one specific issue and the interpretation just doesn't seem right, you also can flag it. Sometimes too, you might be advocating for your client to take a break, right? If your client is really breaking down, is having a very hard time, you're kind of reading their body language and figuring that, okay, right now she, he, they could use a breather. You can absolutely ask that too. And usually asylum officers are very responsive to that. For me, I love a break in the asylum interview because that gives you a moment in the waiting room to powwow with your client, right? There's one bathroom, there's a male and female bathroom, and then there's a waiting area. So if you go really quick and do whatever you need to do in the bathroom, you might have a moment to connect with your client and just reassure them or let them know, hey, you know, you seem to be not mentioning this. Like, that's very important. Remember, like, it's okay if you say that. I know you're nervous. Also, one important point I always make with clients is to tell the officer how they're really feeling in the beginning of the interview. Often an asylum officer will say, how are you doing today? And mostly people will just say, fine, right? Nobody's fine at their asylum interview. Nobody is fine, right? There's a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions, a lot of anxiety. People are terrified. So I really encourage my clients to share, you know, I'm really nervous. I did not sleep last night, or I wasn't able to eat this morning. Just to kind of preface for the officer, this is where this person is, and remind them what this person has endured and how challenging this might be. So you can interject as needed, judiciously. It's kind of like making an objection in court. Like, you know, when do you do it? It's a hard call, a hard judgment call, but hopefully you know it when you see it. Asking for the director is something you can do, or the supervising officer, as Cynthia said. If something is going really wrong, you can ask to speak to somebody else, right? Ask for the supervisor or the director of the asylum office or the section chief, whoever. Or afterwards, you could write to the director to share your concerns. That's always a hard judgment call because maybe the case is going to be granted anyway. But if you really think something didn't go well, it might be good to reach out before you even receive the decision. Okay, next slide. Okay, so as Cynthia said, there might be a point in the interview where the asylum officer will be asking about a bar to asylum. Most often in these cases, it's going to be the TRIG-related grounds, terrorism-related inadmissibility grounds, or material support to terrorism, something along those lines. And so the asylum officer should tell you that they're doing that, and then they will actually be providing you a written transcript that they will print out, and then you would be the attorney reviewing it with your client, the Q&A, and you can make written amendments on the Q&A, on the transcript that you've been handed over before your client signs it. So you want to correct any issues or expand on issues or clarify anything. So you need to be, again, taking those careful, comprehensive notes in the event that that comes up, because you're not going to necessarily remember exactly what your client said. It's helpful to go into an asylum interview with some key points that you want the client to make during the interview, and then you can kind of check them off as the client mentions them. And if they haven't gotten to some really key issues, right? Maybe the one incident of past persecution wasn't really covered, or the reasons for it, or the key things that the Taliban said as they, you know, approached their family members in Afghanistan didn't come out in the interview. You probably want to have those questions prepped at the end. And most asylum officers will give you an opportunity, not always spontaneously, you may need to ask for it. You might say, can I ask my client a few clarifying questions? And then you would basically take on the role of the interviewer and ask your client in a Q&A format. You wouldn't just explain what you want the asylum officer to do. Again, you want it to come from your client's mouth, not yours. And then in addition to those few questions, you may ask to give a closing statement that summarizes the case. A lot of people like to have it available in writing to hand to the asylum officer too. My practice is not to have like a fully written statement, right? I'll have kind of prepped it based on how I think the case is going to go. And I'll try and prep it after the mock interview to give myself the experience of doing that, or mostly the students I'm prepping the experience of doing that. But mostly I would just have bullet points on every single aspect of the asylum definition fleshed out. So, you know, persecution, past persecution, well-founded future fear, because of, on account of, your 5 protected grounds, government inability to protect. I'd have all the elements laid out, and then I'd have specific bullet points, and I would have bullet points pointing to the evidence that I had filed for each of those points for the particular case that I'm representing. And then for the closing statement, you're not necessarily going to go through all of that, right? You may make a judgment call and say, okay, the asylum officer seems really happy with past persecution, right? That check, that element has been satisfied, but they didn't seem to understand this other element, right? That actually there's nowhere else in Afghanistan that my client can relocate to. And so you might want to spend more time on that and more time highlighting your evidence on that point. So yeah, closing statements. You want to practice, I think, most asylum officers, you want to make it like 3 to 5 minutes max. I go with students a lot, and the asylum officers are very generous with them. And sometimes we'll give them like 10 minutes to talk. I think our record was 13 minutes. But I think that you want to be as succinct as possible. And the asylum officer may be taking notes while you're doing it. That's a good sign. But you need to make sure you're speaking slowly enough that the asylum officer can actually capture everything you're saying. I'm usually trying to figure out at some point in the asylum interview too, the asylum officer's background. Like I'll look them up kind of surreptitiously on my phone, on LinkedIn, and figure out what their background is, to figure out kind of where they're coming from and whether they're an attorney or not, because not all of them are, as Cynthia said. Just to get a sense of, okay, is this someone who I need to spend some time educating on the law for this particular case, or are they going to be really solid on that? What kind of background are they coming from? So that's what I have. And then we were going to actually, I think we're doing really well on time, Adonia.
We are. And before we jump into the mock, there was a couple of questions in the Q&A that I thought might be better addressed by both of you, since we do have a little bit of time. So first of all, Cynthia, to you, there was a question about reputable individuals as defined by 8 CFR 1292.1 little a3, which allows reputable individuals to attend an affirmative asylum interview. Is that the case? Who can attend with the applicant?
Well, what I've seen are, for example, social workers. And I think particularly in the context of unaccompanied minors, it was quite regular to see social workers. With that said, there can also be a trusted family member and or friend. So a lot of that, I haven't seen it played out who's reputable, who's not. But I will say is that the asylum office is also on guard for traffickers. So if there is a perceived imbalance in someone wanting to be there at the interview, wanting to go inside, wanting to hold the documents, that might pose a red flag, even if the person is trying to be protective, because the asylum officer's role is to also spot for particular traffickers, especially if the office is located in a place in the country subject to a lot of human trafficking. So that's something to keep in mind, even with an adult trusted friend. I would not be surprised if I'd be surprised if the officer didn't ask, who are you? How are you related to this individual? And how do you think you can assist this adult applicant?
Fantastic. That's really helpful. A second question that we got that I'd like you both to chime in on is about having supplemental documents. When we're thinking about what to bring to the interview, you watched our training earlier about the 589 application process. You filed everything, but maybe you've acquired some new articles or statements that you want to include. What is the best practice for getting that to the officer?
I can answer that one. So typically when you file your asylum application, most attorneys will just file the form itself with the basic required documents and usually explain on the form, I'll bring a detailed declaration and other evidence before my asylum interview, or I'll submit it before my asylum interview. So the asylum office is going to want that documentation to be submitted 1 week in advance. So if you have a Friday interview, you want to make sure it's there the Friday before. Pretty tricky at the moment during COVID because most offices are not amenable to walk-in filings. So you need to either contact the office and get an appointment to go in and file, or you need to make sure it is mailed and gets there 1 week before the interview. So really then you want to have it mailed, like 2 weeks before to allow time to get through their mailroom and get to the asylum officer. You may need to check in with the individual asylum office because some offices too are accepting still some electronic filings, or kind of in conjunction, you can mail and file electronically. It just depends. If you've done that and you've given them your packet of information, right, your detailed declaration, if you didn't file that with your initial form, and any other witness statements, maybe country conditions reports or, medical records, anything, then, and something comes up in that 1 week period, you can bring it to the asylum interview. If it is really lengthy, then they might reschedule your interview if you do that, if you bring something on the day of the interview. That said, if it's key evidence to your case, you are going to have to make a strategic judgment call about whether you go forward without that, or I usually try and hand it to the person at the window and say, we needed to submit this so that the officers at least had a few minutes with it, hopefully prior to bringing you into the room, and they can look at what it is. I will often bring, a supplement page, a 1 page, making any corrections that might need to be made that we noticed in the mock interview, going through the I-589 application for asylum, and I'll submit that at the window, and then the officer has all of that there. So we don't have to spend a bunch of time going over something that's misspelled, or, an address that needs to be updated or something along those lines. So yeah, I would say you want to get most of your evidence there within 1 week of the interview.
And as a follow-up question, would you recommend filing any sort of more formal brief with the supplemental supporting documents?
So I do file a brief. I think the key is to make it as brief as possible. I'm working with law students and trying to train them in legal research and writing. So mine tend to be pretty robust, and we take on very complex cases. But we do kind of a letter brief to highlight the key issues in the case. One thing that's very important for asylum officers, and they really appreciate, almost every asylum officer I've ever spoken to has said this, they like to have what we call an annotated table of contents. And so that is basically, I do it in a table format, but you can just do it in a Word document that basically says, here's the evidence, here's a few bullet points, like what is the key, summarizing this evidence, right? This is the applicant's declaration. It covers this, this, and this. This is the mother's statement. It covers this. This is the cousin's statement. The cousin was there that night when the applicant was attacked, right? This is the medical report from a doctor, just kind of an index almost to the full asylum filing, so that the asylum officer can kind of flip through and understand, okay, what is in this package? Okay, yeah, we have a medical report. We have a letter from a therapist. Oh, there's a country conditions expert. Oh, there's a letter, there's some medical records from the hospital in Pakistan. Whatever the evidence you have is nicely organized. I'll organize my country conditions evidence by theme. So I'll say, so let's say it's a domestic violence case, right? So evidence about violence against women in Afghanistan, right? That might be kind of summarized. Leading with the State Department country report is always the thing I put first, because asylum officers care so much about that. And then I would have another header, maybe impunity for violence against women in Afghanistan. Maybe there's another aspect to the case, right? And it's this person is a women's rights activist, threats against women's rights activists in Afghanistan. And I would kind of pick out the key themes in the case and then organize the evidence under those headers to make it crystal clear for the asylum officer what they have to substantiate the legal arguments that I'm making.
That's extremely helpful.
I just wanted to point out, before we go on to that it's so important to know your local office, because a lot of the offices require, like Lindsay was saying, the documents to be submitted by a certain time. There's a lot of offices, or I know there's a couple of offices that do still accept materials that day of the interview. So I also think that it's important to include information that's going to establish that nexus between the harm that your client has suffered or is afraid of suffering in the future and that report. So a general country report, asylum officers should already have that information. Like Lindsay said, they rely very heavily on the Department of State Human Rights report, but there's also, for any case involving religion, the religious report. But if you want to highlight or you want to check off areas where you think the asylum officer should zero in on, I think that is also very helpful. Something that distinguishes your case or reinforces your case.
Thank you. Cynthia, I had 2 follow-up questions for you before we jump into the mock. A follow-up question about the reputable person. What role would that person have? If a reputable person was able to attend the interview, what can they do?
That person provides support. So that person is not playing the role of representative. That person is not a witness providing testimony. That person is there for moral support, basically.
So I think it's to make clear, the only person that can really represent somebody at the interview is an attorney or a Department of Justice accredited representative, or I guess law students under the supervision of an attorney. One more question I did have for you, something that Lindsay mentioned was, expert affidavits and things like that. And I think some attorneys on this meeting may have questions like, can you actually bring an expert? Is that heard of? What's the practice when it comes to you're able to get a report or a declaration from some sort of expert? How does that play in?
Well, I would say from the department standpoint, it depends on how much time has already been allotted. So you always run the risk, particularly if you're asking this expert to be there, that the officer may say, I'm so sorry, we have to move on. Or can you just let me look at the affidavit? So that's my caveat.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to stop my screen share so everybody can see us really well and clearly. We're going to go ahead and start a mock interview. And we'll have an officer and an applicant, and I'll be pausing folks along the way to maybe have a discussion around some practice tips or maybe how to deal with some things that are a little bit more challenging. So with that said, Officer Harris, over to you.
I renamed myself to make it official. Okay, I just wanted to add on the expert piece. I mean, I've done hundreds of asylum cases and I've never taken an expert to the asylum office. Have also had a lot of success with those cases. So I think most often you're going to just submit the written declaration, written expert report or statement, and not usually experts are not expecting to be interviewed. So I think it would be pretty abnormal to do that. And that's not the expectation before the asylum office. But okay, Officer Harris here. Okay, so Ms. Katz, you can take a seat. This is March 15th, 2022. We're starting at 3:51 p.m. Okay, so my name is Officer Harris, like I said, and I am going to be conducting your asylum interview today. Are you comfortable proceeding in English?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead in English. Just want you to understand that if you did need an interpreter, we do have telephonic monitoring, telephonic interpretation available, and just you're waiving your right to the interview. So I'm going to have you sign a form saying that you're not going forward with an interpreter.
Oh, okay.
Okay. How are you doing today, Ms. Katz?
I'm really nervous. I've left everything. I had to flee my country. I'm just really very nervous.
That's pretty normal. Most people I see are nervous. So, try not to worry too much. I'll tell you about what we're doing here today. The purpose of this interview is for me to understand why you're seeking asylum and to give me an opportunity to gather evidence to support your claim. I'm going to be taking notes, so you'll see me typing, and those will be confidential. I can't share anything that you're sharing with me outside of my office with my supervisor. I will share, but it does not go back to your home country or cannot be released to anybody else without your permission. So just rest assured it will be confidential, and we will consider all the evidence today to make a decision on your case. You have a lawyer here today, Adonia Simpson. Are you comfortable proceeding with her as your attorney?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to take an oath. Do you understand what an oath is?
Yes, she explained it to me. My attorney explained it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask you just to raise your right hand then. And I'm going to ask you, telling the truth is very important, and the consequences can be really serious if you don't tell the truth today. You can actually be permanently barred from any immigration benefit in the US. So I need to ask you today to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth during the interview. Can you confirm that you will do that?
Yes, I will.
Okay. We're also going to sign a form at the end of the interview about that oath. So we're going to go forward in three parts of this interview. Number one, we're going to review your application, the asylum application you filed, and make sure it's complete and true. Number two, I'm going to ask you some questions to understand why you applied for asylum. And then number 3, I'll explain what happens next. You're not going to get a decision today, and that's a normal part of the process.
Oh, is that just because of me? Why won't I get a decision?
Yeah, that's actually a regular part of the process. I need some time to write up my decision. Goes before my supervisor. You'll get it in the mail at some point.
All right, thank you.
So I'm going to be asking a lot of questions, and it's really important for us to understand each other. You can say you don't remember or you don't know in response to a question. It is also okay to estimate if you're not quite sure when something happened or how long it took. Some things are hard to talk about too. So if you need a break, just let me know. It is really important that we focus in this interview, because if we wanted to talk about your whole life, that could take days or weeks. So please respond to my questions. I'm going to use a hand motion at times, maybe to ask you to stop. I'm not trying to be rude. I just need to focus, and we do have other interviews today. I will give you an opportunity to add anything at the end, and your attorney will also have the chance to submit a statement or ask you some questions. Do you have any medical issues or health concerns that affect your ability to speak with me today?
Well, I'm really stressed out. I'm concerned about my family.
Okay. Are you taking any medications?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Are you comfortable going forward with the interview today?
Yes.
Okay. Did anyone help you prepare your asylum application?
What do you mean by that?
Who filled out the I-589 application form? Was it you?
Yes.
Did anybody help you?
Well, my attorney, yes, my attorney helped me. That's my attorney.
Ms. Simpson, who's here with you today?
Yes, Miss Simpson.
And who prepared your written statement? I see a declaration here. It's 12 pages long. Who wrote that?
I wrote that.
Did anyone assist you with that?
What do you mean, assist me?
So did anyone else write any of it, or did you write the whole thing?
Well, I gave it to my attorney. My attorney, had it put into the computer, but I reviewed it. It's okay. My work.
Okay. And did you review everything else in your file? I have like exhibits A through Y here on my desk. Did you review all of the evidence submitted for you?
Absolutely.
Okay. And is it all true and complete?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So we're going to start with the asylum application form. We're going to go over that in some detail. Can you start with telling me, have you ever used any other names? I have Cynthia Katz. Are there any other names you've used?
Yes. My family name is Grooms, Groomes.
Okay. I'm just going to add that in here on the form. So any changes
I don't use it anymore.
Okay.
So let's pause and have a practice pointer on this. Officer Harris, you discussed this a little bit earlier when some information may not be quite accurate. Like what's the best practice here? What do you both recommend?
I think it's really important to have prepared your client not to get defensive about things and to also emphasize to them that it's really important for them to just tell the truth and to explain things and to clarify if they don't understand.
And I also think as far as names are concerned, a lot of times when people see alias, they think it's something illegal, illicit, nefarious, and explain to them, it literally means if you had a different, last name, if you use a shortened version of your name here in the United States, if you were married and divorced, but you used a different name, if you have a nickname, all of that should be on the form. And it just helps speed up adjudication.
And in the context of these Afghan cases, what we're starting to see is there may have been like errors in spelling, maybe on initial work authorization applications. So there may be different various kind of documented variations of the name. And right now we're advising folks, make sure to include that in other names used, just to make sure to be able to be prepared to explain why they might appear in a system with a different name.
That's a great point. I used to see that all the time in the asylum office. And it's so easily explained. People don't need to be nervous about that at all.
All right, so back to you both.
Okay, so if there are any changes, I'm just going to write them. I have my special red pen here. I'm just going to write them on the form, and then at the end, we'll count the number and you'll sign to attest to those changes, okay?
Yes.
So, okay, and are you still living at 2135 G Street?
Yes, Northwest.
Yeah, okay. And it's okay for you to receive mail at that address?
Yes,
Okay. And have you, what's your marital status?
I'm separated.
Okay. So here on your form, it actually says you are divorced. Has there been an actual formal divorce?
Well, that I'm not sure of because I couldn't stay with my husband any longer. And he said he was going to take care of it. So I think that I'm divorced, but some people have told me here in the United States that I may only be separated. So I am not sure, but the marriage is over.
Okay. Do you have any documentation of a divorce?
No.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and check. I'm going to change it from divorced to married because you're right that technically you may still be married here in the US. Okay. And okay, what's your date of birth?
It's March 15th, 1995.
Okay, great. And you were born in Ghazni, Afghanistan?
Yes.
Okay. Do you identify as with any kind of race or ethnic or tribal group?
I identify as Afghan, and Islam is my religion.
Okay. Have you ever been to immigration court in the US?
No.
Okay. And when did you last leave Afghanistan?
I was part of the people evacuated in August.
Okay. Do you know
I have the exact date. May I just look at my paper? August 31st.
August 31st. Okay. And you came to Washington Dulles Airport?
Yeah. Yes.
And you have the humanitarian parole status?
Yeah. Yes.
Non-status. Okay. Have you ever been to the US before?
Yes.
How many times?
Twice.
Okay. Can you tell me about the most recent time before August 2021?
I was in DC in 2017 for a symposium. I was here for 6 days.
Okay. Do you remember the month in 2017?
Yes, it was May.
I actually
May
have
2017.
I actually have March on your form. So do we need to make a correction there?
Actually, I want to look at my passport to make sure I didn't confuse the months. I know it was it.
And practice pointer, this is the second time that our applicant Cynthia is referencing documents. Officer Harris, how would you, or as an attorney, how would you feel about that?
So this is a question that's come up in the Q&A, I think, right? Should applicants have like their documents before them? I would say typically no. I would advise against that. Other attorneys may differ, but I would say this is their story. It's in their head. It's normal for memories of specific dates to differ, and they just need to be honest about that and say, you know what, I'm not quite remembering. And that's fine, rather than kind of generate a date or be looking through your papers or, scrambling. I've had asylum applicants who want to take notes during the interview or who want to reference documents, and I generally discourage that. I don't know, Cynthia, if you feel differently.
I think, well, I agree with you for the most part. If it's something like the actual date, the exact date of an entry, and as long as the person says, well, I know it's in my passport, that will probably be sufficient, because the person will probably have the passport with them at the interview. But you don't want to bog down. So in that sense, I do agree with you. You don't want to bog down the interview with a person looking through, and like a person will say, like I was starting to say, I remember it was in the spring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the person may say something like, well, I saw the cherry blossoms in DC.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's just important that you come across as credible. A big part of this is, does the asylum officer believe you are who you say you are and your story actually happened to you? And so just making sure your client hasn't like studied their papers too hard so they come across as rehearsed or robotic, and that they don't seem to need to consult papers, right? It doesn't look great if you're like, oh, let me just check when that happened. For like an entry date, I think I agree that's different and you can look at the passport. But in general, they want to be kind of prepped enough that they can talk about what's happened, but not prepped too much that it comes across as like rehearsed or like they're acting.
Awesome. Thank you for that response. Continue.
Okay, and I have your passport here from Afghanistan. What is your native language?
Pashto.
Okay, and you're fluent in English, obviously. Do you speak any other languages fluently?
Well, I do speak Dari as well, and some Farsi. I understand, the two are very similar, so I do understand both.
Okay, so I just have
And
Dari
English.
down here. Should I add Farsi? Do you speak that fluently?
No, I think it's fine the way it is. Thanks.
Okay. So we're gonna skip ahead a little bit in our interview. I want to ask you just one thing I was a little bit confused about is I have family members listed here. Are all of your family, your parents are still in Afghanistan?
Yes, unfortunately, they are.
Okay. And then you have 5 siblings, is that correct?
Yes,
And they're in various places. One is in Italy and the one is here in the US. The others are in Pakistan.
that's correct. Unfortunately, yeah.
Okay. All
Just
right.
trying to survive.
Of course. So I've made, I think, 4 changes to your form total. So I'm going to have you sign that at the end of the interview. But now I'd like to ask you some questions about the reasons that you are seeking asylum. I will start with, can you just give me kind of an overview? Why can't you go back to Afghanistan today?
I am a well-educated woman. I had a university position. I have had the privilege, like I told you before, to participate in a symposium in the United States. Everything about me is the antithesis of the Taliban. I used to speak freely to male and female audiences on the role of women in society, how we can have positions of importance, how we can contribute freedom for women to exercise their own lives. So everything that I talked about, women's empowerment, makes me now an infidel.
Okay. I'm just trying to get down everything that you're saying.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. So you were saying something about your work in women's empowerment makes you an infidel to who?
To the Taliban. And I am not saying that, basically what I am saying is that women should be free to choose their own life path. And that's what makes me an enemy to the current government in Afghanistan.
Okay. Have you ever had any problems with the Taliban in Afghanistan in the past?
Just before I left, yes. In 2021, yes. Before that, I had a very, I'm relatively young. So I was educated in a different Afghanistan than the Afghanistan that is there today. But I know what my parents went through, what my mother went through. So things got bad for me in 2021. Things got really, really bad.
Okay.
As soon as we heard that the US troops were pulling out.
Okay. Can you tell me about when did you first start having problems and what happened?
I started receiving threats in after I got back from that symposium, that was like 2017, but then it got maybe 1 or 2 online. But then in 2021, I got threats of my life.
Okay. Can you tell me about those threats?
They said, if you don't keep quiet, if you don't stop, go home. You should be at home. If you speak in public anymore, if you don't resign from your position, we're going to kill you.
Okay. And
how did you from ever talking?
Okay. How did you receive those threats?
Online, at my house. People that I didn't know seemed to be in cars whenever I would leave the faculty, building. It was just, they were just coming at me from all different angles.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about something that's discussed in your statement. I want to talk a little bit about your cousin. I think his name is Ahmad.
Yes.
Can you tell me about your relationship with him?
He turned against me. He was my cousin. We grew up together. We went to school for a while together, and then he just turned against me and said that what I was doing was bad for women and for our people.
When did he start to say that kind of thing?
2020.
Do you remember the month?
Yes, I do remember, because I don't remember what it is now on the Gregorian calendar, but it was around the time of Ramadan. And we would, how families get together in the evening.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, he just started talking so badly and embarrassed me in front of our whole family.
Where would you get together when you would see Ahmad?
Well, family gatherings.
Okay. Did he ever come to your home?
Only as part of, yes, part of the family gatherings that I held.
Okay. How many times did he come to your home in 2020 and 2021?
6 times.
And when he was there, did you ever offer him anything to eat or drink?
Oh yes, it was a family gathering. I greeted everyone with tea. Then we had dinner. We broke the fast, and yes, of course.
So I'm going to pause this and practice pointer this, because a lot of people may start seeing where this line of questioning is going and maybe start getting a little anxious as an attorney, anxious or nervous. Cynthia and Lindsay, talk to us about when this starts happening. It's clearly potentially starting to go down the line of trig questioning. So what do you do as an attorney?
I think you have to let it play itself out, but you want to guard your client's rights. Striking that balance, Lindsay, that's the tough part.
Yeah, I think you're going to be taking really careful notes at this point, because this is heading towards, they're asking questions, and it looks like the cousin may be affiliated with the Taliban. And so you're just going to be taking those careful notes. But I agree with Cynthia at this point. I would let it play out and let the client answer the questions. At some point, you might want to interject and say, officer, we've been going for 2 hours now. Could we take a brief bathroom break? If you feel like that would make sense. But yeah, I think you mostly have to let it play out and see how things go.
And it's even when we were practicing this the other day and this was happening, even me, like, I'm just like, oh, I know where this is going. And you want to do something. You're an advocate, you're an attorney. So it is an uncomfortable situation oftentimes, and taking notes is incredibly important. And I think all of this demonstration, what it showed is just the importance of preparing your client, like walking through this process, trying to address some of their concerns, really talk to them about how to answer the curveballs, and to if something needs to be corrected, just practicing, and as much as possible, identifying any corrections or things that need to happen. We are running short on time, and we do have a couple of more slides to cover. So we've talked about preparing for the interview and going to the interview and being at the interview. So let me reshare my screen so we can talk about what happens after the interview. Are you all able to see everything? Perfect. So what's next?
So if your client, most of these clients are probably still going to be in valid parole status. So if it is a negative decision, they shouldn't just be immediately referred to court, assuming they are in valid parole status. Now, that's an open question as to how USCIS and the Executive Office for Immigration Review is going to understand things. And going to, for example, like if someone didn't get vaccinated as they were supposed to, their COVID vaccines or other terms of their parole, potentially they could have violated the terms of parole and could be referred to court. Assuming that's not the case and somebody still has parole, then you would receive a notice of intent to deny, a NOID, and it would kind of explain the reasons that you had not been granted asylum at this point. And then you would have the opportunity as an attorney to file a response or a rebuttal to the NOID. usually within 30 days is the timeline. And if your case actually is referred to court, you could also file something and request to terminate the notice to appear in immigration court. I often file those in cases. I think that's a tool that's underutilized by asylum attorneys in general. And then the asylum office, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll cover NOIDs on the next slide. So right now, we're very much seeing how this is playing out. So you can go to the next slide, Adonia. We don't know yet, how these cases are going to be handled. There's been a couple of grants. There's been a couple of notices of intent to deny. For example, out of the Boston Asylum Office, there was a notice of intent to deny saying that a former US employee had not established a pattern or practice of persecution against that group. That was a really worrying notice of intent to deny because so many folks seeking asylum are former US employees or affiliated with the US in some way. So we're not sure what's happened with that yet. But I think you really want to, in that case, if you're receiving a NOID, you want to check in with this community and make sure that you're connecting with other attorneys and people, experts, Adonia, Cynthia, others who are handling these cases to craft your response, because you usually have 30 days to do that. So you want to put forward your best effort. So next slide. If the case actually is referred to court, you could file a motion to reopen or a motion to reconsider. I won't spend a ton of time on this because I want to have time for specific questions coming from this audience. But basically, you would look to the Affirmative Asylum Procedures Manual, and that outlines these two processes. And you basically could write a legal brief explaining what happened at the interview. I've also done this where there's been egregious behavior or bad behavior by an asylum officer, right? For some reason, if something went wrong in the interview and you think the case actually should have been granted, then you can go ahead and request that the asylum officer take another look, and they'll determine whether they grant that request. These days, several of the asylum offices have a designated mailbox for these kind of motions or requests. So you might want to ask the main email address whether that's the case or give them a call. And then sometimes they'll go ahead and actually grant just based on the record before them. Other times, most often, they will do a re-interview. I've had several of those in the past, and then positive decisions after the re-interview. Next slide, please. What about while you wait for a decision? We're hoping for this particular community that you won't have to wait too long, because there is the 150-day timeline set by Congress. You should be receiving a decision within 5 months of filing your asylum application, of that asylum application receipt date. Typically, what I do is every month, so 30 days after the interview, I'll start sending follow-up emails to the asylum office with the client's alien number, their interview date, their name, their address, their country of origin, and with your G28 form as an attorney attached, and just explain my client's awaiting their decision. Is there anything else you need from us? Sometimes if there's compelling reasons why the client is especially anxious for a decision, they're still separated from family members overseas, they're especially anxious, they're going through therapy, or they have a mental health diagnosis or something, you might want to flag that. Usually you won't get much of a response to those, but you're kind of creating your record in case you need to eventually file a federal mandamus action, right, in federal district court. So you're creating your record. After 3 months, I will usually loop in a supervising attorney if I have their email address. After 6 months, the slide doesn't say this, but after 6 months, I would, if it's really been that delayed, pursue congressional assistance. So figure out who your senators or representatives are for where your client lives, and then sign the required privacy release forms, usually offered through their websites now, and then ask those folks to assist, get your client to sign the release, and ask them to poke the asylum office. And often within a couple of weeks, you'll then get your decision when you do that. Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes the cases are going through background check security. I think that's going to come up with a number of these cases. So this is our one of our last slides. What if you are granted, right? Best case scenario, granted asylum, just a couple of things. And there's whole webinars or presentations you could go to on this. You're going to want to make sure that your client can access Asylee benefits as appropriate, and we'll hopefully paste that into the chat or for you all. But HIAS has an incredible Asylee outreach project that gives a lot of information on what benefits asylees would be eligible for. And so you're going to want to make sure they do that quickly. It's a little bit complicated with the Afghan arrivals because they have been eligible for other benefits through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So what they're actually eligible for may not change very much, but you at least want to have somebody sit down and do that assessment with them. They should get new work permit, presumably that usually comes automatically in the mail from the asylum office, along with the approval notice and an I-94, a new I-94 form. After 1 year with asylum status, your clients will be able to apply for adjustment of status. So to get their quote green cards to become lawful permanent residents. That is not free for asylees. So if someone's granted asylum, they become an asylee. They right now would have to pay $1,225 to adjust their status, or they would need to qualify for a fee waiver on form I-9112, and that's something else you can explore. But just managing expectations and letting them know that it's not free like it would be for someone who's granted refugee status. You also are going to be able to immediately after an asylum grant file relative petitions. Those are on form I-730 for any derivative spouse or children, either who were not in the US, right, at the time asylum was granted, or for some reason not in the asylum application. If they're not automatically granted with your client, then you can file for them if they're overseas. And then hopefully you're going to share the outcome. There's the PALA spreadsheet, which is the project, I think, for Afghan legal assistance, and it's run by Human Rights First in conjunction with a bunch of other organizations. I think we can hopefully share that link in the chat for you all. But basically, this is all evolving. We don't know how these cases are necessarily going to play out. And so we're gathering information from each other and sharing in forums like this and in other settings so that we can start to assess trends and understand what's happening with these cases and share resources and build on the successes that folks are having across the country. So very helpful to share your outcomes if you can.
And I can't echo that enough. I know it's been we've been checking it frequently to see what experiences others have been having. We really, truly encourage everybody who's been part of this process to chime in. We've gotten several questions about the continuing resolution and the goals for interviews and decisions. Lindsay, what are you seeing as far as compliance with those benchmarks to interview and make decisions on these cases?
My understanding is it's really mixed, right? I responded to one of these questions in the Q&A. For my asylum interview I had in December, there was absolutely no option to go beyond the 45 days. They were like, you have to do the interview on day 44. But we failed very early in the process. And I now think the asylum office, even that one, is overwhelmed and also now not necessarily adhering to those guidelines because they only have a certain number of officers. And that office is expecting 8,000 Afghan affirmative asylum applications at some point. So I think it's been quite inconsistent, even within the same office, as to whether you definitely get an interview within that 6-week period or whether you end up waiting for longer.
I think that's really helpful, and it does vary so much, and we're still learning as we go when it comes to these cases. Before I forget, I do want to make the important announcement about the CLE code. The CLE code is AFG 557. Again, AFG 557. And just to reiterate, it's available for the following jurisdictions: New York, California, Texas, Illinois for live attendees. You'll be getting a form circulated via email after this. And please make note that this is being provided by a law firm partner, not specifically highest in the ABA. So I have to do that bit of housekeeping before we move on. There's a couple questions that I do want to maybe ask if we have time, but I do also want to give a quick plug for this partnered Pro Se Plus Asylum, Afghan Parolee Asylum Project. It is a partnership between HIAS and the ABA Commission on Immigration. It is a fantastic way for law firms and attorneys to provide more shorter term assistance to individuals in this process who may not have access to representation. Something that Lindsay mentioned earlier is just the importance of getting the right information and right representation to folks so that there's just an exponentially higher chance of being successful on the merits of their case. We are going to be dropping in the chat some ways to get more information about signing up on that. A little bit more information of the project is mentioned. This is 4 of 4 in a 4-part webinar. We've covered basic asylum for Afghans. We've covered cultural humility. We've covered potential bars and trig issues. We'll drop the links to those trainings in the chat as well. We encourage that you watch them all, share them in your networks. We really want to make sure that everybody in this space really has all the information accessible caveat to that being that things do change and we learn new things every day and track trends at the various offices. And so that is subject to change. Highest ABA also has a fantastic pro bono guide that's available, as well as pro se materials in Dari and Pashto for the community. So we just want to ensure that everybody has good information and empower folks to really get involved in this work, as it's going to be a huge need over the coming years. So that was my pitch. And I want to just, in our last few minutes, there was a couple of questions that I thought might be worth addressing. First of all, are there, we talked about experts, and I think that's something that's always a challenge. Oftentimes they're required payment or fees. How have you both navigated that as far as trying to find somebody to provide some sort of expert declaration, whether it's about country conditions or mental health? What do you recommend?
I mean, this is almost like what I say to people who are looking for legal services, for pro bono legal services, is you're probably going to explain your case 20 times. You're going to have to call and leave voice messages. You're going to have to email. That person's going to send you to 3 other people by email. Some people are going to say no, and you just have to be persistent and keep trying. I do think that folks really want to help with Afghan cases in particular. However, people with the country conditions expertise are going to be overwhelmed with requests for assistance, right? I think anyone with expertise on like Russia, Ukraine, Afghanistan right now is pretty overwhelmed. I do think though, in these cases, I don't know that you necessarily have to have a country conditions expert because the country conditions are pretty well known, right? The headlines kind of speak for themselves. And so there is a lot you can do out there. And many of the people who are applying for asylum are absolutely who we would consider country conditions experts on the dynamics in Afghanistan themselves. So I haven't been too worried about that in this context. In general, trying to find pro bono experts can be challenging, and everybody should be compensated for their time. I always share that I'm handling the case pro bono, but I also think that it might be a chance if you have the time and energy to talk to your community, because there has been a real outpouring of support. So if you want to be able to make a gesture to a medical expert or someone doing a psychological evaluation or a country conditions report of $250 or something, you could probably fundraise for that pretty easily by kind of rallying your community, depending on kind of the ethical rules at play. You need to think about that, but people want to help with these type of cases. So if you're not able to get something pro bono, perhaps you could try to fundraise a little bit.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. Or a payment plan for some practitioners, perhaps, that might be more doable.
I think that's really great advice. In our last couple minutes, what are both of your parting words as people, take these cases, whether they're Afghan cases or asylum work generally? Do you have any parting advice to our viewers?
I would say, first of all, thanks for fighting the good fight. I know that a lot of you, there's a good mixture here, some long-term practitioners, long-time immigration specialists, as well as those just getting started. And let's function as a community, encourage each other and support each other through this fight.
I really love that, Cynthia, and I'll echo that. I think that this is really heavy work, right? For those of us who've been doing it for some time, or for people who are more new to it. I think we are increasingly becoming open to talking about that heaviness and the toll it can take. I mean, obviously, the asylum seekers themselves are going through a tremendous amount. But I'm of the mindset that it's our ethical obligation as attorneys to manage our own trauma stewardship, right? To take care of ourselves and how we're being exposed to trauma, because we all know that when we are burnt out or tired, we're not being the best we can be. And so I love what Cynthia is saying about this concept of kind of community care, going beyond self-care and making sure we're caring for each other. This is really heavy. So I hope you actually will join us for another ABA Commission on Immigration speaker series talk on April 7th, where we will be talking about secondary trauma and burnout for asylum attorneys, but just making sure that we are taking care of ourselves and tapping into the resources that exist to support one another, I think is really important.
Thank you. And thank you both for sharing your expertise and talent. I know I learned some things. I hope all of the people that tuned in today learned some things. And, to Cindy, in your words, thank you all for doing the good fight. So with that, thank you all for joining. As mentioned, you will receive an email with the recording, the resources,